There's a little bit of everything in this presentation. Let me get started, but the title was drone policy or not. So I want to kick things off because my sense is that students would prefer no by showing a brief video. And there should be sound. But maybe not. You know it's going to be good when it starts like this. So this guy took off in his backyard. Obviously this is a populated area. He's a hobbyist. And he clearly had done this before, whatever that means. Now this is in Sweden, it's not in the United States. So. But it doesn't matter, anywhere you fly. But in my mind, this is the best video I've seen about really why we need drone policy as opposed to just free flight. Now this guy's experienced. He's a good, good in terms of knowing how to get his quadrotor out of the box and read the instructions and start the GUI and click on the waypoints and then take it into his backyard and launch it up into the sky. Now I say that on purpose because if you go back 30, 40 years ago, if you didn't actually know how to fly, you crashed your airplane and you went home sad. And after you did that a few times, either you learned how to fly and be careful or you stopped because you didn't have any money left. Things have completely changed. We now have websites where we can click, order a very capable, say, DJI Phantom, which I think is the most popular one right now. It'll show up in the mail. You can spend about half an hour programming it, and then you have to have absolutely no knowledge or skill to get it to fly like this, over people's homes, over public events, whatever it is. Things like battery charging, who cares? Right, the vehicle will take care of it. Right, things like staying over your own property, respecting your neighbors. Who's going to think about that when there's fun at stake? Right, so I'm not a representative of the FAA. In fact, I'm pretty frustrated with what they've been doing. But I'll tell you, if there was an airplane above the clouds, there is no way this guy could have seen it. In fact, he didn't even know where his plane was because he couldn't see through the clouds. Right, so he's flying in this wonderful little GPS attitude or hold mode, right, without being able to see his plane, which means he has very poor situational awareness. This is first person flying, right? He has a little camera that's taking a video. Actually, it's not even first person because this is a GoPro, so it's retrieved later. It's not like he's seeing it right now. So right now, he's just looking at his GUI saying, okay, I see my GPS coordinates. Right, this plane is not robust and autonomous. It can fly between waypoints. I'm a big fan of autonomy. That's what I spend a lot of time doing with research. But flying between waypoints does not replace the human. What replaces the human is autonomy that actually doesn't just blindly fly to where you tell it to go, that actually senses what's in its environment and reacts. These things don't do that. If you tell it to fly to a particular waypoint, it'll try its best to do it, and if it can, it'll fall out of the sky. That's the way they are. So, time passes. Would you guys do this? The right answer is no. But what will you do versus not? Will you actually go away from Ann Arbor to launch into the sky? What if you're not? What if you're going to 300 feet? How far will you go? I'm on the side of the FAA right now, but things will change. I'm going to bounce back and forth. Right, I'll tell you, one of your groups, and I know there are some people here, I became a very bad guy in the opinion of one person who was learning to fly in this group a few years ago, when I found this person flying a trainer-size airplane, fixed wing, in the orange parking lot, right up the hill. That was unsafe. It was incredibly unsafe. There were cars driving by, there were people walking by, and the response when I said, how could you be doing this, was, well, the Formula One car race is here. It's a very different thing. Yes, Formula One goes fast, but I think people have paid a lot of attention to having it drive in a pattern where it's unlikely to actually go out and hit pedestrians, as opposed to a model aircraft where the person is learning to fly in that parking lot. Right, so there's a lot of things going on. Now, if you've been following this, he doesn't know where it is, so he flips the fail-safe switch. Right, this as if that was a normal matter of course. I don't know where my plane is, so I can't fly it back, so fail-safe. Now, what does that do on a quadcopter? What does fail-safe do? Anybody know? Yeah, returns to launch. So there was a GPS coordinate associated with the guy's backyard. So it's going to go back there. Now, what if the data was a little bit wrong and it was off by, say, 10, 20 meters, and it was a small backyard, and, the guy launched from his deck? What's going to happen? It's going to land in the neighbor's yard or on the house or in the street. But, and you got to like this, it's not working as I hoped it would. The guy was actually running low on battery power at this point. Right? We've been watching this for a while. So now he has full control. He's flying above the clouds manually. Got to like that. Hoping that the battery will last for just a little bit longer. And this didn't faze him, right? He's back up. He has several more videos posted since this. Why am I making you agonizingly watch this? This is one of the few videos that we'll watch. I want you to live through this, right? Because you don't see trouble until you're actually in trouble. Right? And now you're not going to live this by watching this video completely, but look what's happening. This guy has gotten up to where he's above, who knows, he doesn't know what property he's above. He could be in the path of general aviation or commercial jets. He doesn't know where he is. And now he's in the clouds flying manually where he can't see anything. But he's like, I'm going to come down, fighting its way through the clouds. Gotta like that. If you've ever been a manned airplane going through the clouds and you aren't IFR certified, that's a bad thing. People die every month, maybe not every day, but every month, because they get into the clouds and then they lose situational awareness and they either get into a stall or spin or hit a mountain or something like that because they don't know what to do. You gotta like that. It shows up more than once. Don't fight me on this. I'm actually really happy that he posted this because this is like an instructional video of what not to do. I mean, look how populated that area is, right? There are roads, there are houses, there's all kinds of stuff. Right, so what's the other difference? Back when we didn't have quad rotors, but we had helicopters that were very difficult to fly because there weren't all these autopilots and aerobatic and other planes, nobody would ever have taken off in a small backyard like this. All right, so now the batteries are gone, pretty much. Yep, the monitor turns all black, which means it's shutting down. This guy got incredibly lucky. You see that little park below where the vehicle is? You gotta love the GoPros though. They're awesome. Okay, so there were a lot of obviously comments to this. Was it illegal or not? Well, it turns out that it wasn't illegal. Should it have been illegal? In my opinion, yes. You don't want people to be able to go out into their backyard and do that because it's maybe not illegal because of hitting other planes as much as disorderly conduct, the likes of which you would find at a tailgate at a stadium, right? Because in this case, it's like somebody got a large object and started throwing it at somebody in the other, somewhere nearby, Right? So maybe the FAA is not the right person to regulate this, but it does need to be regulated. All right. So let's go back to history a little bit. And how did we get here? Right? Because everybody thinks this policy that we have or lack thereof is ludicrous. Well, there actually is a pretty good explanation for it. So obviously the picture upper right, anybody who's in aerospace will immediately recognize that. One important thing, there are two important points there. One, there was no FAA before they flew, but that operation was actually pretty dangerous. Right? Their risk was very high. But if they hadn't done it, maybe we wouldn't have an aerospace department and be flying today, or that other people hadn't done the same thing. Another thing is that they flew model aircraft. Right? They had a lot of model aircraft that they wanted. They used wind tunnels, and they tried stuff out because they didn't want to climb on a plane that was holding them before they actually had tried to fly whatever their concept was. So model aircraft have been used for over a century. It's not a new thing. In fact, before them. So in 1926, this starts government. Right? Early on in aviation, a lot of people died. There are reasons for that are involving technology. People got lost. Right? Imagine flying with no instrumentation on board except knowing what your altitude is based on pressure, if you're lucky, and then looking out the window to see where you are. Right? If it's nighttime, if you get stuck in bad weather, it was really hard. So a lot of people got lost. Airplanes failed and they crashed. It was a pretty dangerous thing. Even commercial transport was pretty dangerous then. Right? So the notion, government said, we have to do something. We have to, have, they called it air commerce, right? That's always popular in Congress. We're going to start new business. We're going to improve the economy. So that's how things started out. But along with that were air traffic rules, pilot licensing, aircraft certification, establishment of airways, and so on. My favorite one is the last one, operating and maintaining air navigation aids. That was an incredibly useful thing to have because we went from having no kind of standard equipment countrywide to having beacons that allowed you to find airports even in bad weather. So that was really important, and it started us down a path where people didn't get lost as often and had better policy so that the aircraft were better built. The pilots actually knew what they were doing through training programs and so on. Right, so then you keep going. The first kind of bureaucracy-like agency was this Civil Aeronautics Authority, which was established to investigate accidents and use those investigations to suggest ways to prevent them in the future. That sounds very much like the NTSB now, which works with the FAA. So the idea then is that you use these investigations to improve policy as well as training and information that's disseminated. So then it was split into two parts. One had a lot of the rulemaking for air traffic control, certification, and so on, and the other one, which later was kind of farmed into the NTSB, was more for accident investigation, although they had safety rulemaking at that point. And then there was this regulation stuff. If you remember, there was deregulation of the airlines that happened later. Right, so why am I going through this? Well, I want you to see that there was a very long procedure involved in going from the Wright brothers up to today. There were a lot of different forms of rules. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. They were modified. And if you see these timelines, it goes over several decades. Right? So now we're like, we want policy, we want it now. But if you look at the history of policy, there was no such thing as policy happening now. An agency would be created and there would be a whole long negotiation process, and eventually the agency would work with government to have some kind of new rules put in place. Well, okay, so eventually we became, there was the FAA under the Department of Transportation. 1960s saw modern air traffic control where there were things like radar and air traffic control centralized facilities to keep track of where planes were and so on. And some of those modernized facilities are still operating today, which is why you hear about vacuum tube systems breaking and causing trouble. I like to think most of them are gone, but there are still a few, as far as I understand. So in 1982, there was this National Airspace System plan that then became NextGen in about 2002. And we don't really know what next gen is today, but what we understand about it is that it's a slow incremental process of incorporating technology into all of the aspects of civil aviation. All right. So where did I come from? Well, I learned to fly. And why do I put this up here? Well, the reason I put this up here is that I think that there is a lot that you learn as you're flying a small airplane that translates into understanding a little bit about why policy is necessary. Right? So it's not just that you learn stick and rudder flight. In my opinion, it's debatable whether that's even very important with a lot of automation. But what you do learn are the value of checklists and following them. And I have struggled throughout my entire academic career as a faculty member to get students to use checklists or to write them and then use them. Right? That's hard. Checklists are good. Airspace, instead of just saying, I'm just going to fly a little bit, enjoy the day, paying attention to what the different classes of airspace are, how to talk to air traffic control when you're transitioning between places in the airspace system. Flight planning, how do you make sure, it's not like a car where you just get in and stop at a gas station. Right? You have to be able to say, given the winds, the fuel on board, the weight of the aircraft, the balance, you have to do everything to make sure that you are actually ready to fly. Because if you're in the air and something, what you just saw in the video, happens, you're going to come down, right? It's not like you can just pull off to the side of the road and get out. You have to finish the flight, ideally at an airport where you can open the door and climb out. Well, I think all of these things kind of give you a better understanding of what you need to do. So, one of the things that I do want to point out, though, is that even when I was learning to fly, which was 1993, we were going to this risk-averse culture, which in my opinion has serious implications for pilots today. No longer do people have to learn how to handle spin or any sort of other aerobatic maneuvers. What was happening is in primary flight training, people were dying because, well, you actually have to recover from spins, and it's not always easy, and if you get in the wrong airplane, you can break parts. And so the FAA decided to make that optional. Well, they had a marked decrease in the number of student pilots that had accidents and were either killed or seriously injured. But at the same time, we now have airline pilots who have never been in a spin. No kidding. Commercial airline pilots. Next time you go to the Detroit airport and climb on board, there's a good chance that your pilot has never been in any sort of unusual situation beyond basic flight training. Right, so I also flew model aircraft, and for those of you that know Keith Shaw, doesn't he look almost the same now, except that's a very shadowy picture. So I learned to fly model aircraft when I was here in grad school, so I did research, but we also built the airplane that had been sitting on top of the entrance there. It didn't make it into my thesis prominently, but it was still fun, and it taught me a lot about flying model aircraft. And at that time, it was perfectly fine to join AMA, the Model Aircraft Organization, go out to the local hobby fields and fly around. Well, that didn't last. Right, so later in the presentation, we'll talk about what happened once government started to realize that model aircraft were going to proliferate in a way that they had never anticipated before. But first, let's talk about policy. This is about drone policy, so the place to start is to talk about policy more generally, because that is where the drone policy has been passed down from. So, Federal Aviation Regulations, or FAR. There's been a book published since I've been flying, certainly, called FAR AIM. This book, if you are interested in drone policy, you got to at least go to the website. Right? It's now electronic, and this presentation, you guys can have it. If you don't find it from SGT, then let me know, send me email, and I'll send it to you. It has a lot of links in it. It's a big book, right? Thin newspaper-like print. If you printed it all out, it would be like this, right? What does that mean? That means there have been a lot of regulations written. This is the chapters. So CFR means Code of Federal Regulations. That's the regulations for everything. Part 14 includes aviation. So that's why we say 14 CFR. That's the Federal Aviation Regulations. So it's organized by chapters. So Chapter C has a whole bunch of subsections Two that are very interesting are Part 23 and Part 25, which are airworthiness for aircraft, the normal category, which would be like general aviation, and transport, which would be like Delta Airlines. Now, there are separate chapters that talk about airman certification, pilots, instructors, and so on, airspace, air traffic control, and under general air traffic operating rules, there's this Part 91, which describes how you fly as a general aviation pilot, but then everybody else inherits that plus more. Right? So Part 91 is viewed as what you start with, and then as you become more specialized, you get more. So Chapter G has sections, or Parts 121, which is air carrier, and 135, which is unscheduled or on-demand operations. So what these people have to do is they take Part 91 and then add to it additional requirements, basically. So what that means then is that if you are Delta Airlines, you operate under Part 121, but you inherit all of these other requirements as well. You can't ignore the airspace. You have to have certified airmen, and that's also classified by, are you a private pilot, a commercial pilot, a flight instructor, and different levels. So this is the way it's organized, and it is a very big book. We can't toss it out. As much as we might want to, we can't just toss it out, because manned aircraft still operate, and even pilots who are 18 years old that learn today to fly are taught this. This makes a great deal of sense. When I was a student pilot, this was my Bible, right? I would open it at night and read a few pages and go, wow, I didn't know that before, right? This is how you learn to fly, not just to operate the airplane, but to be a good citizen and to understand what other people know and what you do. This has had a pretty serious impact on drone policy, though, because this has established a precedent for separating things like general aviation from for-hire or commercial operation. So if you kind of look at it loosely, the experimental and the general aviation categories have translated over. Experimental is like hobbyist. General aviation, well, there's no direct translation, but you could think of it as kind of the low-level user like a university. And then commercial is everybody else. Now, even with this, there were exempt categories, right? So DoD has never certified its aircraft or its people using FAA standards. They have established their own set of standards, which makes sense for them. That, in turn, established this precedent for having government agencies be able to self-certify their equipment. Now, those of you that have heard the term COA, Certificate of Authorization, what that means is not that you have passed any FAA policy standards to certify your aircraft. What it means is that you as a public or government agency have self-certified your vehicle. That's just the way it is. That's fine with DoD. They have more paperwork than many of the FAA offices require. So it was a thing that worked for the manned aircraft, and it needed to be separate because the DoD aircraft had way different requirements than did the civilian aircraft. Right, so this is where we start. And you know, interaction is good here. Do you guys, what would you guys do with this book in terms of drone policy? How would you deal with it? Right, because the reality is, I don't have time to do this tonight, but if you actually go to that ECFR site and look at Part 14, you'll see in very fine print. When I say it's like a Bible, it really is. I'm not particularly religious, but if you open it, you see, you know, chapters and numbers, and it looks like that. It really is that long. A lot of different subsections refer to occupants on board. Right? I would say about 30% of the different policy statements deal with the person, the airman, and the passengers being on the airplane, and the aircraft being large enough to support people. So there are rules like you mustn't impart but a certain number of Gs to the occupant on board. Right? So these things just don't apply. But there's another number of others that do, in terms of you don't want the aircraft to fall apart in the sky, you want the person to be able to navigate properly and so on. So it's hard. The biggest recent upgrade that was done was to go from vacuum tube systems to fly-by-wire systems with all of the glass cockpits. And they did manage to do that. Interestingly enough, they did it for Part 121, the air carriers, before they did it for general aviation. So there was a period of time where the GA people were like, wait a minute, they're all flying with glass cockpits and fly-by-wire. What about us? So they've kind of caught up a little bit, and there were exemptions and exceptions and all that. So, but anyway, I think this is an important slide. And I didn't get any answers, but I was hoping for a lively discussion here. So any comments, thoughts?
How much of that is to protect other aircraft and anything that's on the ground?
So the ground one is a really interesting question. I'm going to get to that. Airspace is all about keeping people separate, right? So, for example, there's a Class B airspace, Class Bravo airspace near airports that you can't go in unless you have radio and transponder, all of the equipment that allows air traffic control to see where you are. So that sort of regulation needs to apply to the drones also, at least the ones that are going to enter that sort of airspace. A lot of the ways that we fly, right? How do you file a flight plan? Does the drone file a flight plan and reserve a slot? If it's a big drone like Global Hawk, it better. So all of the things pertaining to communication with air traffic control by voice, which is required right now because most of the other aircraft do it. There are a lot of people that argue that you learn from voice things that you wouldn't get from data link. I didn't say I was one of them. I think data link is higher bandwidth. But it is true that you will hear some things by voice, especially from GA pilots who might be panicked or confused, that you're not going to get from the data link. Now, you could put a video camera looking at them and get some data, but that's a separate topic. But there are things here. There are things that you need if you're going to share the airspace.
When does airspace start? Or does it go
Oh, that's an outstanding question, and I so disagree with both the university and the FAA on this one. I mentioned the university bashing. We'll get there. Right, so 14 CFR versus the drone, and that versus is the key one. Right, so we have all this history that doesn't apply directly to unmanned aircraft. And the fact is, I think because it's an easier problem, government have tended to deal with the large UAS like Global Hawk and Predator sooner, that and DoD pressure and so on, than they are dealing with the small unmanned aircraft that have much different mission profiles and fly low. That's just the reality. Some people say it's a conspiracy that the large companies are invited to come in and serve on the committees and they're influencing all this. That's possible, but I wasn't going to put conspiracy theories on my slides because I'm not sure I agree with them. I do think that given the current regulations, it is easier to fit Global Hawk in than it is to fit an Amazon Prime Air drone. Just because it's going to fly like the commercial planes fly now, just without a person on board. Instead, you have 10 people sitting at workstations on the ground. Right, so policy takes a long time. Maybe we'll get a small UAS rule, maybe not. As of last week, when I spoke to somebody at the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, universities were not in the small UAS rule. So the whole outcome from this long conversation, which was quite disappointing for me, was that this guy was going to say, FAA, where are the universities? We'll see what happens. What they did include was commercial, and the hobbyists are already flying. Right, so now you have the question, how has anyone flown? We have all these regulations and drones don't fit in. So there's this wonderful document, Advisory Circular 91-57, which was actually from 1981, which is a long time ago, but model aircraft had been around way before that. Well, so this document set model aircraft operating standards. It said very common sense things, which were wonderful, like fly under 400 feet because other planes won't be there. Fly line of sight because that's what you know, right? If you start flying too far, then you're going to lose perspective, just like the guy you saw flying above the clouds. He had no idea where he was. That's why he hit come back home, right? It's because he didn't know where he was. So that was a very common sense document, and that has been the source of everybody claiming they had permission to fly. So in about 1997, government said there are too many people, we're not going to let everybody fly, so they decided that the hobbyists would be sliced off and be separate. They could fly for recreational purposes, and that everybody else didn't pertain to Advisory Circular 91-57. Right? That's just the way it was, and they have several releases from magazines where they were informing people about this. Now, did they create rules? No, but that's what they started telling everybody. and they have been doing that ever since. Right, so they said, here's what we do, right? Public agencies, you need COAs. DoD, flying restricted airspace, or they're also public agencies so they can get a COA. Commercial, you gotta love this, just don't fly. Right, so we have lots of reasons to fly. This is a Fontana that I have in my lab. It can be flown at model aircraft fields, just as safely as model aircraft that's flown by hobbyists. This one, they cut off the title, but this is the Flying Fish seaplane that you also see milling about here. I think one of them's under the plane right outside the store, that way. And you know, one of the things you have to start thinking about is a lot of these that fly low are more of a danger to what's on the ground than they are to other airplanes. And so if you look at all this policy, you got to start scratching your head and saying, why are we spending all of our money and attention on detect and avoid when in this low area of airspace, provided we're far enough away from approach and departure corridors to airports, nobody else is there? Well, if you ask the FAA that, they say, we own down to the ground. There's this wonderful document called Mythbusters. Have you guys seen that? The FAA Mythbusters document, look for that on Google, where they call it a myth that anybody has any right to airspace ownership and control directly above their ground, right? So they have, with that one statement, taken, just like the railroad and the road companies took land 100 years ago, they have basically staked a claim to the airspace all the way down to the blade of grass, all the way down to the blade of turf in the big house, which we saw in no small detail, right? There are Supreme Court cases that say they shouldn't have done that, but that's what they've done. So there's a little bit of confusion there where the biggest thing right now up for debate and for policy is this slice of what's called immediate reaches airspace, which is close enough to the ground that it impacts the landowners or the agency, say municipality or park or whatever, that owns that land. But that hasn't been recognized yet. So recent history, 2013 and so on, we have test sites. These are completely useless for academia because we don't have enough money, like in MFly, to drive to Virginia every time we want to fly. Well, it's not a practical thing. Well, so you guys could apply for a COA, but you have to get an N number or apply for a waiver for one. And then when you apply for the COA, it takes at least 90 days to get approval, and you can't change the design or the software. Well, that doesn't work out. That's why people like me have been kind of hiding our eyes and looking the other way when people like MFly go out and fly, because government is confused. They allow these competitions to happen, like SAE Heavy Lift, but they don't have a policy where any of the universities can actually fly legally and participate in those competitions. So that's just how it is. Nonetheless, these test sites were established, and for commercial companies that seemed to provide some promise. Now in 2014 you can apply for Section 333 exemptions to fly. Now there's a big thing that people need to realize apart from press propaganda here. That is not policy. That is exemption from policy. Specifically exemption from the manned aircraft airworthiness certification policy that would be impossible to achieve with experimental unmanned aircraft. Right, that's a big deal. So the movie makers haven't somehow convinced the FAA that their aircraft are safe and should be mass produced and sold everywhere. What they have convinced the FAA is on their movie lots, which have pyrotechnics and people doing stunts all the time, that, oh, by the way, they can fly quadcopters or hexacopters. So this is not some great victory where we now have policy. In fact, quite the opposite. It's continuing this propaganda type thing by letting some people go out and do stuff and making it seem like there's great victory. Privacy also was our enemy, right? In the sense that people confuse a flying vehicle with data collection and dissemination, right? If you go to Congress right now and you show up at a young staffer's door, and for those of you that don't know, it is the 20-something staffers that control government, not the old people that you see on TV. Right? That's 100% the case. So anyway, if you go into a random staffer's office, they will become absolutely livid at the idea that you want to enable drone flights, because they will be all over the fact that we're going to lose the remaining civil liberties and we need policy to keep people's privacy intact. right? And so then you try to explain to them the difference between data collection and sharing and just flying, and the fact that our civil liberties are being violated by not allowing us to do what we want to do on our land. If you're a Democrat, you don't hear that. You're all over the policy. If you're a Republican, you hear it. And so maybe now, and I'm not particularly Republican versus a Democrat, but in this issue, the Republicans are our friends. Just like they are for letting people have guns, right? In this case, NRA is our friend. Now, this sounds bad, especially in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? But there's a different philosophy in government. And you beat your head against the wall, and eventually you figure out that you have to have two glossy prints, one for the Republican staffers and one for the Democrat staffers, and you have to say different things. And hopefully they'll achieve the same goal. If you go to the FAA, they say, our hands are tied, Congress is telling us to do these things. That's how I ended up going to Congress's offices in the first place about this. So this guy named Perker, who really shouldn't be very famous at all, the lawyer, Brendan Schulman, is the one who should be famous, actually managed to deflect one of the fines that the FAA levied by getting an NTSB judge to agree that there was no established UAS policy that needed to be complied with. This was just earlier this year. That case is being appealed, and meanwhile the FAA is trying to close the gaps so that by the time this case is finalized, they'll have closed the gaps so nobody can use that defense ever again. Right, so how are they trying to close the gaps? Well, one way is by issuing this interpretation of the special rule for model aircraft. This came out in about June, and by my understanding, even though they asked for comments, it was in force the day they released it. So that's as of June. They said things like that by dictionary definitions, recreation is just that, and students are not doing recreation. They're paying tuition. So you guys are not hobbyists, and you're not flying for recreation according to that document. Now, this was such a well-written document because it also said things like, oh, and by the way, hobbyists can be regulated if they're causing a hazard. Now, that seems to make sense at first, but what it does is it basically says we interpret what Congress gave us in this Modernization and Reform Act to say that we can, in fact, create policy that hobbyists need to follow, which also means that they could create ridiculous policy that hobbyists need to follow, not just common sense policy that hobbyists need to follow, right? And so, as a result, the model aircraft people, academia, and industry all filed suit against the FAA. It was beautiful. Everybody who flies filed suit against the FAA, except government, and I don't think they can do that. There were some people at NASA who wanted to, but they couldn't. Yes?
Sorry, just to clarify, so if I'm a student at university, if I want to fly something, the drone, because I'm paying tuition to the university, it's not affiliated with the university activities.
No, if you go out to Toys R Us and buy a quadcopter, you know, order your own DJI Phantom and use it responsibly, although that's up to you. Yeah, you can still fly. Now, there was a little thing in there that I read that seemed to suggest that because I am paid to help do research with unmanned aircraft, that I can't go home and fly at night, and I can't teach my kids to fly. And I looked at that and I'm like, sometimes you just got to interpret it the way that's favorable, because that is definitely a violation of any civil liberty. I mean, how could they possibly tell me that I can't teach my kids to fly? That's ridiculous. So, but it's a, you know, go there and look at it, right? If you read closely, what it basically says is the FAA is claiming to be able to regulate everything. And we'll see what happens. These lawsuits are active right now. And if any of the three of them are successful, they'll have to back down from at least some of the wording that they put in. Now, here's the football game story. And as you see, there's a tether on the right. So what happened in September? Well, Aerocentennial, SkySpecs wanted to fly. You guys know most of the story. I think you guys do know the whole story, right? Well, at least most of it. So a lot of vintage airplanes at the Utah football game. All that was going to happen, despite Bloomberg reports of swooping into the stadium, was that the thing was going to fly out of the tunnel about 10 feet above the ground, go to the middle of the field, drop off the football, and go back. Now, all of this was going to be about 10 feet off the field, and those of you that have been to a game know that that actually is below street level. Right? So the FAA banned this flight despite the offer to fly with tethers that were held firmly by people. that was never going to fly more than 10 feet above the ground. And what they've been saying in press ever since then is all the university had to do was ask for permission. Well, how would we have asked for permission? The hobbyist was flying the airplane. There was no money changing hands. The university didn't even own the airplane, so we couldn't apply for a COA. What they're suggesting is that we should have applied for a COA. You know, the local FAA guy that approved the vintage airplane flights would have had no idea what to have done with this. He would have called Central FAA and they would have said, oh yeah, they're a public university, they can apply for a COA. That wasn't going to happen. Right, and so then what did they do? Well, 2 days before the game, and this begins my anger at the university shared the news story. They were supposed to do it 15 minutes before the game started. They did it 2 days instead because they wanted the PR. Well, and so Bloomberg then said that his craft would be flying into the stadium. FAA panicked, and then the whole force of the Unmanned Aircraft Program Office came down on this poor guy at Willow Run who had no idea what was going to happen to him. Right? There was yelling and all kinds of stuff, by my understanding. And in the end, the athletic department and the general counsel of the University of Michigan decided to cancel it. I think that was a mistake, and I don't mind if the video hears me say this, because this was the classic, they shouldn't have taken this airspace case that we need to push. But maybe the university didn't want to be the one to push it, and they would have had to have been the one to push it. Yeah, I tell you, if Brendan Schulman had been here, he would never have said stop. He would have been like, I'll get out there myself with an airplane, right? Give it to him, give me the football, you know, I'll go out and fly, right? And maybe that would have been good. But as it is, because it never happened, there's no way to follow up on it because the flight just didn't happen. Now, SkySpecs, the company that built this, they didn't lose out because they got so much free publicity. Right, this was like the top, it was like the #2 story on all of news for the entire weekend. So, you know, people were talking to them, you know, investors, they were like, don't you just realize you got $15 million of free publicity from this? And they backed down a little bit and they were like, okay, well, maybe it wasn't so bad. So anyway, so what's going on here? Well, what is this threat? Well, an unmanned aircraft is called an aircraft regardless of its size, altitude, or speed. Right, that's what we're being told. Right, and well, the fact is that there was offered a tether, and well, maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. There was an FAA document, which I think I actually did not put on the next slide, that said that a tethered aircraft was not an aircraft, but it expired on July 30th of this year. And so then when we brought that document to their attention, there was no replacement. It just expired. There was nothing else that talked about tethered aircraft. They were like, oh, that's expired. Oh well. So then there's this question of immediate reaches airspace and the fact that we would have needed a COA, but we didn't own the airplane. And well, this last one is really the telling one that makes me understand how important it was for the university to have done this. And that is that as of October 27th of this year, which was a little over a month after this game, the FAA finally added into their language for the TFR, temporary flight restriction, that unmanned and radio-controlled aircraft couldn't fly. That was not there on September 20th, yet they told us that we would be violating policy without any definition of what that was, and that there was a TFR. So, right, so this is talking about this, and basically what they've said now by including unmanned aircraft in this TFR is that a kid like this within 3 miles of the stadium can't launch a tiny little airplane off their back deck. No kidding, because that would be a violation of this TFR. Now, TFRs are very useful. The reason they're there is to prevent manned aircraft from causing a hazard, a nuisance, to prevent terrorists from coming to games and so forth. And that's a really good reason to have these TFRs. But the thing is, that guy doesn't need to be stopped within 3 miles of the stadium, and the quadrotor didn't need to be stopped at the bottom of the stadium. What needs to happen, again, is common sense. And the TFR that goes apparently from the ground, if you give the FAA that authority, up to 3,000 feet, now includes unmanned and radio-controlled aircraft. So if you guys live near 3 miles, closer than 3 miles of the stadium on game day, if you fly, you could be arrested. What's that?
Even if I fly a drone, like my quadcopter?
Absolutely, and this is it. Right, so this is the NOTAM, the Notice to Airmen, that came out on October 27th. And the authority, they always cite at the bottom how they're connecting it to policy so that they can basically ground it as a modification or enhancement to policy. So you see what was highlighted here. This is what it was before. And the ... means that this is the first part of a couple, but the others couldn't fit on this slide. Right, so basically what they've said is that you can't fly, jump with a parachute, or now fly unmanned or remote-controlled aircraft. Right, so yeah, if you're in your backyard within 3 miles of the stadium, yeah, the FAA can come after you. Now there's this question of enforcement, but that's another issue. Right, so how long, I think it's 7 o'clock, so we probably should stop pretty soon. But let me show a couple more slides and then, you tell me. I'll keep going if you want, I'll stop if you want. So the big thing here as we transition from manned to unmanned is to recognize the real risks and to deal with them. Right? So what we really are in a situation of is that we're going to pose more risk to people and property on the ground than to other aircraft in the air. And so as I've been telling everyone that I run into that will listen, we have to look down. We can't just avoid policy, but we have to look down. We have to say, is this an urban or rural area that we're going to fly over? What is going to happen if we crash? If we're in the middle of the desert, you can fly big stuff under 400 feet really fast and cause almost no hazard. But if you're over Ann Arbor, you probably shouldn't fly anything that's bigger than something very handheld that doesn't have fast spinning rotors on it, because there might be a bicyclist that happens to pass by and you might happen to not see them and hit them. Or your autopilot, which probably does not know where any pedestrian, car, person otherwise would be, will just fly that waypoint. Right? So these are issues. But the easy problem really is to say, instead of solving the Amazon prime air drone problem, let's at least fly it away from people in rural areas. So if you look at that path, then you end up saying the following. Well, let's split off, whether it's 400 or 500 feet above ground, let's split off that airspace from everything else. The federal aviation regulations are pretty reasonable above 500 feet. Because there you really are in the public highway, whether it's general aviation, commercial, military, whatever traffic happens to be there. If you just have drones randomly wandering around above 500 feet, they do in fact pose a hazard. Right? And we need to acknowledge that as a community and say, if we're going to fly, we're not going to go up above the clouds. We're not going to go up to 3,000 feet and hope nobody's there. Right? So we need to remember that. Then the second, and then we need to get government to recognize that that lower airspace is non-navigable by the definition of navigable that it was originally set out. The FAA is only authorized to regulate navigable airspace. That's an important distinction because what they have basically done is said because of helicopters and now drones, they get to regulate all the way down to the grass. Well, if you back up a little bit, the intent of navigable was that they regulate above 500 feet. That's a debate that's going to have to come through the court system because there are different sides, right? So there's this United States versus Cosby case from 1946 where the Supreme Court very clearly, and you can find this online if you're interested, defined this airspace called immediate reaches. They did not specify an altitude for it, but what they did say is that if the landowner can benefit from the use of that airspace, it is neither controlled nor owned by government. It is controlled and owned by that landowner. So what the FAA has done in their Mythbusters and through their actions is to basically violate that particular regulation or that particular Supreme Court case. That's a big deal, but the problem is, how do you make them do it? How do you make them actually acknowledge that case? And by the way, the FAA is not all evil. I learned about this case from somebody at the FAA. Right? So they're actually in the middle of this, right? They're trying to do what's right, but they're not sure how because it's such a big government machine that it's very hard, even for well-meaning, very informed and intelligent people to actually make a difference, even from within the organization. There's a whole book that's been written on this topic, which is pretty interesting to read, skybook.org, called Who Owns the Sky? And it goes into all these legal cases and talks about precedents that have been set through various decisions that have been made by the court system. Yeah?
How does that affect wind turbines?
Wind turbines. Well, if you look at the FAA's Mythbusters document, What they would say is that they even have to approve flights that would be below the tops of wind turbines. Now, I think any helicopter pilot or manned aircraft pilot in the world is going to say that that's completely stupid. They would never in a million years fly that close to a wind turbine. Too dangerous. Yet, if you give the FAA control of airspace down to the blade of grass, it doesn't matter what's there. And in fact, if you talk to Brendan, the lawyer, what he'll say, and he's asked them these questions, is that if you have an opening and closing roof on a stadium, if it's even open a few inches, they consider all of the airspace in the stadium as under their control. Right? Even if you couldn't fit a small quadrotor through that roof. If you close the roof all the way, then you're indoors, and then it's not their airspace. Right? And so then he went down the path of, well, what if you open a garage door or a big window in your house, or even a small window? You crack open a window in your house. Well, they pretty much hung up the phone at that point. Right? But we're getting ridiculous here. It's not common sense. It's based on arbitrary decisions. Right? And basically what they lack trust of the drone community. They think that if they give people authorization to do stuff, that they'll abuse this privilege. And they are fueled by the hobbyists. All those YouTube videos that go up make them afraid of authorizing operations. What they have failed to realize, and especially Congress fails to realize this, is that the least trained people have been given the card to fly, and the best trained people have been told they have to do a lot of paperwork. Now you guys are, no offense, a little bit on the least trained end and as undergrads and grad students, but you know, if you go out and fly with hobbyists and actually learn from them as opposed to just going and doing irresponsible things, you can be safe. Right, so you know, this is an illustration showing this, what I'm calling Class U airspace that would be sliced off from everything else, except near airports. So the idea here is you're not trying to encroach on major airports and take their airspace and get in the way of approaches and departures. You're just taking this Class G, which is ironically called uncontrolled, but it's anything but that for drones. It's uncontrolled for general aviation. You can do what you want. You don't have to talk on a radio. And so I think the FAA would then, and the pilot community would say, well, that makes it dangerous for drones, because if you're in a Piper Cub without a radio and a drone happens to be up there, they're not going to be able to talk to you on the radio because they don't have a radio. Well, this creates tension between the pilot community, who doesn't want to spend a lot of money to buy equipment, and the drone community, who are like, why can't these people just buy modern electronics and talk to everybody? Well, that is what it is, and it's a debate that's not going to be solved in this room tonight. But until it's solved, if you don't slice up and segregate that airspace, you have this very real conflict where you have people without radios flying around that can't see little drones, and you have drones flying around that may have all kinds of equipment, but that can't get away of out of the way of a Piper Cub, because even the Cub is faster than the little quadrotor. So this is basically talking about my harebrained scheme for dealing with property classification. So if it's rural, suburban, urban, privately owned, government owned, there should be different requirements. And these colors are coming out really funny. But you know, basically, if you are on a big 1,000-acre piece of land flying in the middle of it, as long as you can geofence yourself, meaning you're not going to leave that low altitude airspace or cross the boundaries of the property, you shouldn't have any requirements at all. Right? And that's the same, that's the drone equivalent of the FAA's allowing the Piper Cub in Class G airspace to go wherever they want. Right? That's the mapping, and there's a clear policy for that. And then it goes down from there. I mean, in my opinion, if you're going to be flying in a crowded city, you actually need somebody who knows what they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to have to be a commercial manned aircraft pilot, but it does mean that they need more training than going out and showing you can fly around a pattern at a local hobby field, or that you can read the instructions for a DJI Phantom and program in waypoints, because these things don't teach you safety. They just teach you how to get the thing up in the sky. So there's the spectrum, and do we know what to do with it? No. Does the FAA even see this need to separate things? Well, I think people with common sense do, but they're not sure what to do with this, because it would be a big deal just to slice off that layer of airspace. And then there's the question of, well, does the FAA control it or does the landowner control it? But the first thing is to slice it off. And then once you slice it off, then it becomes a question of dealing with drones in that layer, one of the things that I think we all recognize is that that is the layer where the small UAS are going to be. Right, above 500 feet, they can go there, but that's not where the main mission is. On the other hand, if you slice this off and you give landowners control of their airspace, this also prevents the prime air drones from going there. Now, I think that's a bonus. If I own land, if I have a scenic lakefront home, the last thing I want is for the FAA to authorize a whole stream of prime air drones to fly over the middle of the lake. Because then I sit on my back deck in my lawn chair, finally done with work, and I look over the lake and I see a bunch of drones flying over it. Well, for me, that actually would be okay. I think that would be kind of fun. But most people would not want that. So there's both the enabling and the prohibiting side of actually controlling and owning your own airspace. And what I would tell Amazon that would not be popular with them is, you guys can fly up to 500 or 600 feet. Basically navigate in a very thin layer there to go from point to point. In fine print, get the user to sign away permission to land in their backyard. Right? And anybody will click on that. I want my prime air package now, flown in by drone, and so they'll have like two pages of you're responsible for your own safety and we have permission to land on your backyard anytime you want to. But then when you say yes, then they can fly in because you've given them permission. Right? So there's a lot of things that we can do, but getting there is hard. And right now, we're kind of stuck in this world where the FAA thinks one policy will fit everyone, and that's, in my opinion, just not the case. So do I have an answer? I think this is the answer, but the FAA isn't there yet. AIAA is probably going to be organizing a session on Class U airspace at their aviation conference next June. So we'll see what happens there and go on. Anyway, thank you. My particular area of focus is on autonomous systems, looking at how I can either make the system behave in a more intelligent way or